All right, so here's our review. This review is really supposed to go with the review sheet. I have not given it out yet, so I will give that out tomorrow on October 3rd. Today's October 2nd. So we're going to go ahead and go over this. If you've been with me the entire year, you're going to see some things that we've already learned. I mean, all of these slides, if not all of them, most of them, we've already went over this stuff. So this is just a general review in case you've missed a day or two, and this will help you fill in those gaps to help you succeed on your benchmark test. All right, so let's go ahead and start. So first things first, we're going to talk about the ecosystem or ecology. Now remember, ecology is the study of those relationships. Anytime that I've talked about ecology, I've always brought up the word relationships. And as a matter of fact, I made you write that in your journals when we first did it. So ecology is the study of the relationships among organisms and their environment. So not only is it relationships between organisms, it's also the organisms and the environment. So next, ecologists study environments at different levels of organization. Those levels of organizations are important, and we're actually going to go over them in a second. So just make sure you know what the different levels of organization are. So that begins with population. So let's go over that real quick. So, I'm sorry, not population, organism. That starts at the basic level. So the organism, you cannot get smaller than an organism when we're talking about living things, or we're talking about the levels that the ecosystem is organized. So first we talk about the organism. Then we moved over and we talked about a population. Remember, a population is going to be groups of organisms living together. So a group of alligators in this example is our population. All right, next, community. A community includes groups of different living organisms. So you have alligators. On the picture we have the turtles, the birds, even the plants. You see the bird has a fish. These are all different forms of what we call a community. So make sure you don't get confused on what a community actually is. So a community does not include non-living things, which are our abiotic factors. Our ecosystem, this is where we talk about those non-living factors, those elements in the environment that are not living. And it gives good examples of them right up here. So make sure you know that the water, rocks, and climate, soil, these are all non-living things. These non-living things do have a big thing to do with the ecosystem, because remember, we're talking about relationships, but they are not living. All right, and then biome. This is a major regional or global community of organisms characterized by climate conditions, plant communities that thrive there. They characterize them. So when we talk about biomes, we're talking about the tundra, the rainforest, the desert, even aquatic biomes such as the fresh river, the deep ocean biome. These are all groups of living things forming a functioning community. All right, this is that concept that I wanted you guys to definitely know. Make sure you know the difference between biotic and abiotic. So we're going to go over it. So the ecosystem includes biotic and abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are non-living things, while our biotic factors are living things, the plants and the animals, fungi, and I don't know if it says it on here. Yeah, but bacteria as well. Bacteria are living things. Please don't get that wrong. I know fungi don't move a lot, plants don't move a lot, but they are definitely living things. So when we look at the word bio, I want you guys to recognize the term. When we look at the word biotic, I want you to recognize the prefix bio. That prefix bio means life. So right now you're taking biology. Biology is the study of life, living things. So there's no reason to get that one wrong in our test. All right, non-living things. So when we talk about non-living things, we're talking about moisture, temperature, wind, sunlight, soil. These are things that exist in the ecosystem, but they're not alive, okay? So whenever you see a prefix A usually means not. So when we talk about bacteria, and sorry, the pen is, I don't know why it's writing like that. Well, I do know why, it's because I'm writing on this iPad. But anyways, when we talk about things like bacteria and fungi, these simple creatures, a lot of them have something called asexuality, where they can just reproduce by themselves. So that means not sexual. It's a process that happens all on its own, or the animal can do it all by itself. Okay, so sunlight, moisture, they exist in the ecosystem, but remember, they're not alive. All right, a keystone species. We talked about this before, and I remember going into the reasons behind it when we're talking about ancient architecture. I don't really think it's used in modern architecture, but I mean, it could be. But remember, the keystone is something that's going to hold it all together. I remember going to a museum, and basically you put the keystone in the middle, and it holds the other blocks against each other. So usually when talking about the ecosystem, a keystone species is something like this beaver population right here, in which is going to allow the entire population, the entire ecosystem to basically function. So when we increase the water by building these dams, the beavers, they bring fish, and the fish bring other predators, and the predators sustain the ecosystem by keeping the population of fish from overgrowing and eating all the producers, and they just keep everything in balance. They keep it in check. Now, how do we know that the beavers are the keystone? Well, if we remove them, the entire ecosystem would not only literally collapse, it would physically collapse, because then you wouldn't have the water. But anyways, moving on. Now, this is the big concept. I mean, I don't know how many times they're going to ask you about it, but I guarantee you they want to make sure that you know that producers provide energy for other organisms in the ecosystem. And not only that, they provide energy for themselves. So know that producers produce their own energy primarily, and then they share that energy with other organisms. And then know what a consumer is. Consumers are organisms that get their energy by eating other living or once living resources. And then don't forget that word, heterotroph. I am going to cover up the word wall on this test. Well, you can't see it, it's right behind me. Make sure you know these words. I don't want to see you trying to look at the word wall or anything like that. Hetero, that means different. It eats different things. And I don't know if it shows the word for plants, so I'll go ahead and write it up here. But for plants or our producers, those are going to be autotrophs. Autotrophs. So auto, that means it can automatically eat. It doesn't need any other organism to provide its energy. It provides it all by itself. Only plants. Well, sometimes we'll talk about bacteria that can do this. This is only organisms that can either do photosynthesis or a process that I know I talked about is called chemosynthesis. And that chemosynthesis, that I remember talking about the deep ocean biome, and you have these tube worms down there that are able to, they have this bacteria that can convert those extremely toxic chemicals into sugars and starches in which the plants or animals can thrive on. Almost all producers attain their energy from sunlight. Remember, chemosynthesis is one way that they don't. Oh, here it is right here. So chemosynthesis, that's where producers use chemicals as an energy source. Photosynthesis, producers use the light. So photo, think of flash photography. They use light as their energy source. And here's an example of chemosynthesis. You have these hydrothermal pools that are sometimes found in, I think, Yellowstone. It's like a deactivated volcano, but some of the heat still rises up, and they create these hydrogen sulfide pools in which organisms can take that hydrogen sulfide and convert it into sugar and sulfuric acid. There's actually a guy on social media trying to be silly, stuck his foot in there, and I want to say he has some terrible chemical burns. Anyways, moving on. So food chains. We talked about food chains. That was 7th grade. The food chains, they connect organisms. So a food chain is going to be one unbroken chain from producer to consumer to decomposer. So a food chain is one linear path. It's very easy. Now, I do remember going over this. Make sure if I was to ask you what's another name for this organism, you're able to tell me it's an autotroph. It's a producer. It cannot make its own food. It does photosynthesis. And this one right here, you should be able to tell me that it's a consumer. And I would ask you what type of consumer, and you'll say a primary consumer because it eats the herbivore. I mean, it's a herbivore. It eats the producer. So make sure we know this stuff. And then the hawk, we say it's a secondary consumer because it eats another consumer and such forth. But it's a food chain. It's one interrupted chain. Also, you should know what those arrows stand for. They like to to ask students, hey, what does that arrow mean? The arrow means energy is being transferred from one level, one trophic level, to the next. And for my students who don't know what a trophic level is, I'll explain that in a second. All right, so specialists are consumers that primarily eat one specific organism or a very small number of organisms. So that'll be something like our tertiary consumer. They have a very defined appetite. They don't just eat everything. Usually these tertiary consumers are very targeted, and they're actually evolved to eat one source of prey or a couple sources. Generalists, these are going to be things that are like humans. Humans, if we don't have enough animals to hunt, we'll eat the roots of plants. If we don't have any roots of plants, we'll eat the fruits of plants. If they don't have fruits, we'll eat the seeds. If we don't have seeds, we eat the leaves, and so forth. So generalists consume almost anything or everything to stay alive. Tertiary consumers are not, or specialists. So a food web. Note that a food web shows a complex network of feeding relationships. So whenever we're looking at a food web, our food web is going to emphasize complicated food chains, basically. It's basically taking more than one food chain and turning it, combining them, linking them all together, figuring out how these organisms function together, and you make it into a food web. Here's an example. So with the food web, you should be able to make at least 3 different food chains. I remember we made these, we labeled one, and if I were to go through and ask you who or where were the producers, you should be able to tell me, wherever it's starting at, like these algae that are in the ocean, that's a producer. How do I know it's a producer? Well, it takes sunlight and it converts it into energy and it feeds another organism. That's a producer. Then we have these phytoplankton. Photo, it uses sunlight through photosynthesis to make its energy, and therefore it's a producer. So not all consumers are alike. These basic classes you need to know. There we go, decomposers. You might have some overlap between the terminology of a detritivore and a decomposer. Let me clear that confusion. So I didn't go over these, but I kind of already did. Herbivores, carnivores, omnivores, I'm expecting us to know those. So if you don't, just read that definition, you should know what they are. Now, detritivores, that's the new one. That one might be a little bit difficult to understand, but a detritivore is an animal, it's much like a vulture. It's not going to really hunt or eat any living thing. A detritivore is going to eat the dead organic matter, like worms. Worms make their living by eating dead things. They don't hunt. It'll be weird to see a worm hunting its prey. It doesn't. It eats dead things. Now, decomposers, on the other hand, they do fall into the category of detritivores, but at a molecular level, they break down organic matter into smaller compounds. So that's where decomposers play a role. And I do believe you have to know that one of the main decomposers that do this is bacteria. Bacteria is a decomposer. Don't forget that. Bacteria is responsible for returning these nutrients that build the bodies of animals and gives them all of their life and their vigor, breaking that back down and returning it into soil. So, and I do remember asking all the students, is this a producer? And we know that a fungi is not a producer. It cannot make its own energy. So what is it? It is a heterotroph. So that's something to know. It cannot make its own food. It's a heterotroph. It's also a decomposer. It's also a detritivore. So our trophic levels, we have our primary consumers. These are herbivores that eat producers. We have our secondary consumers. These are the ones that are hunters. They eat prey. Excuse me. Got the hiccups. Tertiary consumers. These are carnivores that eat secondary consumers. So these are those specialists. Your primary consumers are typically going to be your generalists, or your omnivores are going to be your secondary consumers. So right here we have our omnivores such as humans. Omnivores are going to eat both animals, so both plants and animals. There is some evolutionary benefits to being an omnivore. All right, so there we go. You should be able to pick out all of this. I remember doing this in class. Remember, primary consumer is going to be this right here, this little field mouse, and then we have the snake that's going to be our secondary consumer, and then our tertiary, this fox right here. Energy pyramids. Okay, energy pyramids. What we need to know about this is easy. So as we move up the pyramid, that was almost a good arrow. So the bell is about to ring in a minute, so you're gonna hear a bunch of commotion, but we're gonna keep going. On this energy pyramid, as we move up these different levels, so my picture is blocking it. I'll try it on this side. As we move up the energy pyramid, at each level, we are losing energy. When you see arrows right here, this energy is lost as heat. Now you should know that energy being lost right here is lost as heat. That's heat energy that's just lost into the atmosphere, into the environment. The normal human body temperature, 98.6. So in order for you to maintain all of your cellular functions, your body has to stay at 98.6 degrees. So even when you're not actually running or competing, your body is burning energy. Now, as we move up the energy pyramid, as we're going up from the bottom to the top of the pyramid, these are called trophic levels. So from here to here, we got one trophic level. This trophic level will be our primary consumers, and then we go from here to here, our secondary consumers, and then from here to here, our tertiary consumers that are at the very top, our apex predator. Now, if I was to say I had 100 joules of energy down here at the bottom, we need to know that only 10% makes it to my primary consumers. What happens to the 90%? It's lost as heat energy. And really what produces that heat energy sometimes gets trapped, and that's why we can burn trees and these carbon-rich plants in order to heat our homes sometimes, and actually what break down and become fossil fuels. But anyways, moving on. So 10% of 100, my primary consumers would have 10 joules available for them to use. If one of these look like prairie dogs, ate one of these, I'm guessing gophers, if it ate one, it would only have 1 joule of energy. Remember, we're going to waste energy as heat. And then to my tertiary consumers, I'm going to take 1 and divide it by 10, moving my decimal place over. I would have 0.1 joules of energy available to my apex predator up top. So this is known as the 10% rule. They always ask that question. How do we move? We take this number right here, divided by 10, and we move up to the top. So this question right here, as energy travels up, it gets lost. How is it lost? Well, it says why, but I'm going to tell you how in a second. Yeah, through cellular respiration, that energy is lost as heat. There we go. That's the part I need you guys to know. And also that you know that 10% is the amount that goes up. So the amount that's lost, 90% is lost. 90% is lost, 10% goes up. That's why we divide by 10. Please don't forget that. All right, we have other pyramids that we talk about. Sometimes we have a biomass pyramid that's talking about mass. We have a pyramid of numbers, but all you need to know is that these ecological pyramids are balanced. They show going from going from a broad support base, which is usually made up of the producers, and moving to the top, and that once we get to the top, that the organisms that are up there have only a little energy available to them. Okay, this is a repeat. Here we go. All right, ecological symbiosis. So symbiosis makes up a couple things. I know we normally talk about 3, the mutualism, the commensalism, and the parasitism, but I don't want you guys to forget that competition is also a symbiosis. So a symbiosis is basically just a way that animals interact in their environment. So a symbiosis is any interaction that 2 animals share. Like I said, it can be mutualism, and I'm gonna put these little signs on here so you know so you can kind of have a way to memorize. So mutualism is plus plus. Both animals benefit. Parasitism is plus minus. One benefits, one is harmed. Commensalism is going to be a plus 0. So it's a plus neutral. The one organism is not affected. That's like a bird building its nest in a tree, and it's not hurting the tree at all. It's also not helping the tree. And then we have predation and competition. All right, so competition. Usually with competition, you have animals that are competing against each other, usually for a mate, which we talked about for the mechanisms of evolution with non-random mating. But competition occurs when two animals fight for a limited resource. Remember that in an ecosystem, everything is limited. We wouldn't have an energy pyramid if resources or energy weren't limited. So animals have to fight with each other, which is intraspecific, and they have to fight against other species, which is interspecific. And remember, you should know what makes an organism a part of a species. Predation, easy to understand. Animals eat each other. Now, here are the three major types of symbiosis or symbiosis. We have this fruit bat right here. This bat is eating a fruit, and what it's going to do is it's going to help spread the seeds. So when the bat goes and it defecates or releases its bowels, it's going to be dropping the seeds into fertilizer in the ground somewhere. A new cactus can sprout from those seeds, and that's where you have the mutualism. The cactus benefits by having its seeds grow, and the bat gets the food and the energy that it needs. All right, and commensalism, this is probably the hardest one to understand. With commensalism, you have to know that one organism is definitely benefiting. The other one is not being harmed. It's also not being helped. These are like those little mites that live in our eyelashes. These small little microorganisms, and actually bacteria, they live all over our skin. A lot of them do help, but most of them are completely neutral. They don't worry about us, and we don't mind them. So if you were to zoom into the human eyelash or where our eyelashes are coming from, you usually find these demodicids or demodicids. I gotta find the correct pronunciation, so I'm not teaching you guys wrong. But anyways, you find these inside of the little crevice of our eyelashes, and they basically feed on the oil that's there. And they don't cause us any damage, but we just give them a place to live, so they don't help us out either. So parasitism, that's where one organism benefits and the other one is definitely harmed. So with this one, that's definitely going to be a plus minus. So one organism is going to benefit by having either a food or somewhere to get nutrients, and the other one is either going to be the food or it's going to be at the expense of the food. But either way, one of them is going to benefit plus minus, the other one is harmed. And if I was to go back, just to drive the point home for commensalism, they put like they cancel out the 0, but we're gonna say plus 0 for commensalism, and then for our mutualism, with both benefiting, plus plus. All right. So another big topic right here, the carbon and nitrogen cycle. One thing I want to make clear is that the Earth is a closed system. So with this, everything is recycled. So the carbon doesn't just drift off into outer space. It gets recycled and recycled. And the same thing with water that you learned in the 8th grade. We have precipitation. The precipitation comes down. Plants soak it up, or it stays on the ground until it evaporates, or we transpire. We breathe it out. We do breathe out a small amount of water every time we breathe. Goes into the atmosphere, it condenses, condensation, and those same cycles over and over. Carbon works similar. Trees, they take in carbon dioxide. They take it in from the air. They breathe it in. They use that carbon dioxide to create sugar, and they release oxygen. Well, we take in the oxygen, and every time we breathe out CO2. So make sure you know that relationship that we have with plants. Plants, through photosynthesis, are going to act as a sink for carbon dioxide. Plants take in CO2. Animals release CO2. We breathe it out. Also, one thing that we do to release CO2 into the atmosphere and the environment is by burning fossil fuels. Earlier, I said that plants kind of hold on to that heat energy. We release that heat energy when we burn plants or we burn fossil fuels or coal or any organic matter, and that organic matter is released into the environment. So what could we do to stop this? Well, we can plant more trees. We can stop cutting down trees. That could help too. One thing, let's see if I have a picture of it. I'll come back to the nitrogen cycle in a second. So one thing about the carbon cycle is that it's going to create something called the greenhouse effect. Greenhouse effect. And what the greenhouse effect is basically these gases being trapped in the atmosphere. When these CO2 gases get trapped in the atmosphere, they basically are able to stop heat from escaping. They keep the heat lower. One way to think about the greenhouse gas effect.
Good afternoon, Mr. Barber.
Let's give it a second.
As we prepare for dismissal, just a reminder, ELA, English Department, ELA, you are on bus ramp duty the month of October. Again, ELA, you're on bus ramp duty the month of October. And got a couple of shout outs. We want to shout out a couple of birthdays from Saturday. Mr. Wow. Happy birthday, swoop, swoop. And Miss Kate Wilson in Theater Arts, we want to give you a happy birthday shout out. Your birthday was on yesterday, but we recognize you, both of you, on today. Swoop, swoop. And yeah, students, remember, college night is tomorrow. Plan to be at the MO Campbell from 3 to 6 p.m. for college night. And here in Eagle Land, we recognize the month of October.
So I'll just pause for a second. We'll come back. All right. So yeah, so the greenhouse gases kind of work like when you cook something in the microwave and you put the microwave cover on it. Carbon dioxide is a heavy gas, and when it gets trapped in the atmosphere, it kind of sit on top of our environment, not allowing the heat to escape. Well, what that does is it raises Earth's temperatures. So those are called greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and what it's called when they get trapped and they stay over us is called the greenhouse effect. Remember, think about putting a dish over the plastic dish, the plastic dome over your food when you use the microwave. That dome allows the heat to stay on top of the food. It's not a good thing for our environment, by the way. All right, so the nitrogen cycle. Here's another cycle. Now, nitrogen really doesn't work exactly like carbon dioxide because humans, we do breathe it in, but we don't trap it in our bodies as good through our respiratory system. The way we get nitrogen into our body is by eating foods. So one of the main things is protein. Whenever we eat protein or what makes proteins, the amino acids.
Jamarian Jordan, please come to the front office.
Okay, so those amino acids make up they make up proteins. Those proteins are in our diet. Whenever we eat those proteins, we turn them into muscles. Now, whatever we don't eat comes out, and that's referred to as detritus, which should give you kind of some context for the word detritivore because they eat dead things. So here we go. This right here and this right here. Well, what kind of microorganism would this be? Of course, it would be bacteria. And this decomposer over here would be fungi. These detritivores break this nitrogen down, and a lot of them actually live in plant roots, and they return this nitrogen to the plant roots, giving plants the nitrogen that they need. So animals need nitrogen, plants need nitrogen. One of the highest sources of nitrogen would be beans. Another word for beans is legumes. So make sure we know that. So the nitrogen cycle works differently. Usually when animals die, they break down, or whenever they produce detritus, it breaks down and that nitrogen is in the soil. So I don't want you going and putting scooping up your dog's mess and putting it in your parents' garden because it has to go through a process. It takes a while for the bacteria and the fungi to actually break it down and release the proper nitrogen for the plants. If you did that, you'd just kill your plants. And don't do it. All right, succession. So this picture is kind of showing succession over time. It's showing what used to be a river. The river over time dries up, and from that you get a forest that grows on top. So with succession, you need to know that it's a gradual process. Succession does not happen all at once, and it takes a long time. It's a gradual process, and I do like to emphasize that word gradual. It takes a long time. So it's a gradual.
At this time, we need first floor to be released.
All right, yeah, it's a gradual replacement of one plant community by another. It happens over time. It's a natural process, and it can be primary or secondary. So those are two things that we need to know. I remember from the STAR test last year, they asked that question. You have to know the difference between primary and secondary succession. So first, primary succession, basic point blank, is that it begins without any soil. Primary succession is going to happen without soil, and a lot of times it happens, or all the time, it's really going to be, it happens on rock. So primary, I want you to think rock. And things that can cause primary succession would be sides of volcanoes where the magma comes out or the lava comes out and it cools down and it hardens and becomes rock. Landslides, floods, also avalanches can cause primary succession to start. Now, after you have just that bare rock, which is what is showing right here at the corner of this picture, over time you get these little lichens that start to grow there. If I was to ask you what a lichen was, I can care less if you know actually what it is. It's a mutualistic symbiosis.
Final call, all bus riders, final call, all bus riders to the bus ramp. Once again, final call, all bus riders, please report to the bus ramp.
It's a mutualistic symbiosis between a fungi and algae. Now, if you don't know that, oh well, you really don't have to. You do need to know that it's a pioneer species, though. A pioneer species is the first species to grow during succession. And we talk about lichens, and another species we talk about is mosses, which I think is on the next slide. All right, so soil starts from lichens. Soil starts to form as lichens, and the forces of weathering and erosion help to break down rocks into smaller pieces and moving them into new areas. When these lichens die, they decompose, adding small amounts of organic matter to the rock to make soil. So that's where we have succession starting. Remember, succession is going to be where we break down these living things. When we break down rocks and weathering, erosion, but we mix that with the bodies of these dead plants, and that's actually what becomes soil. If you ever go to Home Depot and you look at a bag of mulch, it's usually just broken wood, dead wood. And if you take that mulch and you set it on top of a tree or you put it on top of a plant to try to keep that plant steady and keep it from drying out, over time that mulch just breaks down and becomes regular soil. So that's primary succession. Also, organisms that we call pioneer species are things like mosses and sometimes ferns. They grow in the very first layer of soil. So these are pioneer species. Remember, a pioneer is somebody or something that does something first. All right, so after we have our initial layer of soil made from our lichens, our mosses, and our lichens, mosses, what's the other word I'm thinking of? Lichens, mosses, I think that's it. Maybe I'm adding too much. Let me double check. Oh, and ferns, sometimes ferns. You'll never see ferns on the test as far as a pioneer species. So anyways, forget ferns. But anyways, after we have that initial soil layer, we'll get other plants that come in, either by the wind or wherever. It could be flooding that brings new grass seeds and other seeds there to sprout. So whenever we do see these grasslands, one thing grass can tell us about an area is that we have very shallow soil. That shallow soil adds to the biomass of an area, and as the grass dies, decomposes, and breaks down, it allows for bigger and bigger plants to grow there. And eventually, we end up with an area that looks like this. And this is what we would call a climax community. So a mature forest, so a climax community. Now, we already know what the word community is when we're talking about the ecosystem. A community is the mixture of living and non-living things. So a climax community is where we have shrubs, branches, but eventually when they all grow to full maturity, that will be the climax community. It's a mature, stable forest. That's a climax community. So a climax community equals a mature, also stable ecosystem. That means it's not going to change much. Like it's pretty much at where it's going to be. And that's usually a good thing for animals because then they can have a certified niche. And if you remember what the word niche means, it's basically everything an animal needs to live. It has somewhere to live, it has a food source, it has all the resources for life. So here again, we're showing primary succession. You should know that the start of primary succession is going to be bare rock. So we're starting with rock. And then we have the lichens. And these are also called our pioneers. Or pioneer species. And then after the pioneer species live, grow, and die, they add to the soil. We get the grasses that are growing on that soil. Then we get bigger plants. And over time, we get bushes. And then we get these big trees that grow there. And eventually, we end it all as a climax community. Now, let's talk about secondary succession. When this climax community is damaged for any reason, or let's say a hurricane, flood, tornado comes by and kills all the trees, or a forest fire burns it down, one thing that it doesn't take with it is the soil. So secondary succession is easy if you understand primary. Secondary succession is started by something like a catastrophic event, but it's when a ecosystem, a mature established ecosystem is reduced and changed, but you have pre-existing soil. So that's the only difference. With secondary succession, I want you to think soil. So secondary, you start with soil. That's secondary succession. And basically it's similar to primary after that. So with your soil, you have grasses that grow. The grasses grow, die, decompose, bigger things grow. You get bushes, trees, shrubs, and then you get these mature trees that make up a forest. All right. So that's showing secondary. See the forest fire burning the forest down right here. But remember, even though we have everything looking pretty bad, even in this picture right here, we see that we get grass already sprouting up. And from the grass, we get sedges and bigger plants and then baby trees. And then eventually we end with a mature, stable climax community. All right, evolution. So that's ecology. This next part is evolution. Evolution should still be fresh on your mind. So we don't have many more slides to go. But let's go ahead and break down evolution. So evolution, remember we have this guy, Charles Darwin. He was the founder of the theory of evolution. Not the theory of evolution exactly. Actually, his grandfather started that. But he found the mechanism for evolution. So here we go. So he went on a 5-year voyage on the HMS Beagle. And what he found when he went on that voyage is all sorts of animals that looked similar, but also had these very, very dramatic differences. Now, that led him to observe that species vary globally. And with him noticing that, he was able to construct his theory of why and how they were able to develop these differences. One thing you're going to hear a lot when we talk about Charles Darwin is that voyage to the Galapagos Islands, and you're going to see that it's going to talk about finches. But first, we'll talk about these tortoises. And really, I think there's a tortoise from the time that Darwin went to those islands that lived up into the 1900s. I'm pretty sure it died. I don't know. Tortoises can live to be a very old age, but I remember it was a very popular tortoise. They call it Darwin's tortoise that he supposedly saw and marked, and they said it was his. But anyways, if we look at these turtles, these tortoise, I don't know how you say tortoise plurally. Tortoises. But anyways, we have these tortoises, and here we have one that can stretch his neck. This guy right here can't do that. So what that would tell us is that it's possible that these organisms had to stretch their neck up to get food that was higher. If not, they wouldn't live. They wouldn't be able to pass down their genes. So this is an example of how animals evolve and adapt to their surroundings. So he also found fossils of marine animals, which led him to see that there were some extinct organisms. Now, one thing that Darwin knew, he knew about artificial selection. So one thing that we have to know about artificial selection is the fact that we use artificial selection in our daily lives to make bigger fruits. So it says some plants bear larger or smaller fruits than others. And what we do is we capitalize on that. If we have a plant that makes slightly bigger fruit, well, that's the plant that we plant all the time, and we breed that plant. And over time, we breed bigger and bigger varieties of it. It's something like the grapefruit. The grapefruit wasn't really discovered until like the 1800s, and it's huge. But what they had is they had oranges that were brought over here to the New World, which is modern day Americas and the islands. And that bred with some wild species of tree, and it made a hybrid, which is the grapefruit. And then people love the grapefruit for some reason. I mean, I really don't understand why. But they planted more of those, and that's how we artificially select and we cultivate things that we like. So it says some cows give more or less milk than the herd. So what a farmer would do is he would breed the cow who gave more milk because that's beneficial to his environment or to his living. So Darwin saw that variation could be passed down from parents to offspring. So if humans can control and dictate this process, he knew that nature could as well. So artificial selection, humans are the selective force. He realized that natural variation provided raw material for evolution. That's like the hornless bull. Farmers breed bulls that don't have horns. Why would they do this? Because they don't want to get gored while they're feeding the cattle. All right, so artificial selection. So he used artificial selection to breed fancy pigeons. I don't know why, you'd want to breed a pigeon that looked like this, but I guess, that was exotic. But anyways, we use artificial selection in our daily lives. I mean, dog breeds. There are so many different dog breeds, and we use dogs for 3 reasons. We use them to be companions. Sometimes we use them for sport, and we also use them to hunt. So we breed them to suit those purposes. And as a matter of fact, the reason the poodle was bred the way that it was originally a hunting dog. And poodles were actually bred for their coats to be slightly waterproof. So that's why their hair looks like that. But anyways, Charles Darwin knew that animals had to struggle to survive. And that's true. So when organisms go through this struggle, it drives them to be more competitive against other animals. And one of the factors Charles Darwin cited was variation and adaptation. These natural variations are made by slight mutations to our genetic code. This is why we look different from our siblings. There are very slight, minute differences that make us different from the people around us. And no matter how many children a couple has, they're all going to look slightly different. Some variations are more beneficial, and those variations can lead to organisms being faster predators, being able to capture prey more efficiently, and then the prey can be actually born to be faster as well, getting away, or to be camouflaged, like the zebra stripes. The zebra stripes were made according to the theory of evolution because the certain zebras that had these stripes were harder to catch. So eventually they were the only ones to produce that trait because they didn't get killed by the lions quickly. All right, so those are more just adaptations. I mean, if you want to pause and read what it says on that slide, you're more than welcome to. All right, so with survival of the fittest, remember this is the 4-word way of saying what natural selection is. And then we get this term fitness. What fitness means in the evolutionary terms is how well an animal is suited for its environment. So fitness in the evolutionary sense is not how strong an animal is or how fast it is. It's how quickly or how best an animal can adapt to its environment. So, which is why Charles Darwin said the human race was so successful, is that humans can adapt to almost any condition or any climate. So good adaptations allow organisms to survive and pass down their genes. So good fitness is the ability to reproduce. And he thought that this was similar to artificial selection, except instead of man choosing with artificial selection, we get nature choosing, which is the biggest principle of natural selection. It's nature choosing the traits that are successful. And survival is more than just staying alive. Remember, when we're talking about evolutionary fitness, we're talking about passing those favorable adaptations, those genes, those genetic traits down to offspring. All right, here we're looking at this famous example that's usually cited by every textbook I've ever seen. We're looking at one species of crickets. They're all trying to live. You get one that's born with this green mutation and the rest of them are brown. Actually, you have two. And then as the bird is flying by getting its food, it's going to take out the ones it can see easily. So these brown ones are going to be taken out the quickest because they're most obvious. And then eventually you end up with a population where the green crickets make up the majority of the population. Since they're the same species, the brown genes are not eliminated. It's just that they're less likely to show up. But eventually, maybe in a few thousand years, you wouldn't see any brown genes anymore. Or you'll see like maybe the grass turns brown and then this one has the evolutionary benefit and you see more brown crickets than green crickets. And we talked about this video. We watched it, I want to say in all classes, where the bird was doing all the dances trying to attract the female bird. This is the mating display. That's natural selection. The female bird is sitting right there observing, considering what traits should be passed down to the next generation. But artificial selection is where humans breed for traits that we need. It doesn't benefit a sheep to be weighed down by all of that fur or that heavy coat, the wool. But it benefits us. So we breed sheep that have these thick coats so we can shear them and use that for clothing or whatever material. We breed racing horses. We breed certain horses for show, for their mane. And when we don't want a big horse, we breed smaller horses. Remember, we breed pigs from wild hogs. So wild hogs are, organisms that have these tusks and they're very ferocious. And we breed them to be nice, docile, very fat, and also delicious pigs. All right, moving on. All right, natural selection. It's the process by which organisms best suited for their environment survive and reproduce. So his four postulates. So his rationale for natural selection. We have variation. So first you need to know, okay, yes, variation. Variations that are beneficial are passed down to offspring. Individuals vary in their ability to survive and reproduce. So that variation can lead some to survive and reproduce more than others. And then individuals that have the favorable adaptations are more likely to survive and reproduce. And that is how we get organisms that are best adapted to their environments. All right, so the evidence. We talked about 4 pieces of evidence of evolution. So one is biogeography. Usually with biogeography, you're going to see them talk about animals that are similar, even though they're found on different parts of the continent. Like we talked about the pangolin, the anteater, and the armadillo. All found on different continents, but they come from the same ancestor. All right, and these are those famous finches that are always talked about. These birds have different beaks based on what they eat. So these ground finches have these crushing beaks. They're seed eaters. They eat seeds that fall to the ground. Therefore, they need a beak that's adapted to breaking those seeds. You have the insect eaters that are going to have these sharp beaks, and these are made for tearing the wings off insects. And then you have the parrot beak finches that are fruit eaters. And you have the cactus eater finch who has basically a specialized beak and so forth. But all these different 4 types of beaks are made based on the food source that this animal has. And this is the geographic distribution. The name of this animal is escaping me, the one down here. I think it's a capybara. Yeah, capybara, and then we have the beaver. These are animals that are found in the American continent, South America, and then you get North America. But we see that they differ based on their geographic location. But if we were to go back or even to look at the genetic code, we know that they were very similar. All right, fossils. Fossils are one way that we support theory, or we use fossils as evidence for evolution. That's because fossils show sometimes organisms that no longer exist, or they can show that species have changed over time. So that's fossil evidence. This is one thing, a lot of kids get this wrong. A lot of students get this wrong on a test. Remember, when we're looking deep down in these fossil beds, the older fossils are found lower, newer fossils are found higher. So fossils can tell us about the age of the earth. Remember that we have the evolution of a whale, which started out as something like this and eventually evolved and morphed into something that we have like this today, and killer whales and everything else. All right, next, another piece of evidence of evolution is comparative anatomy and embryology. So comparative anatomy is going to talk about those homologous traits. So here's the basic definition of a homologous trait. Same structure, different function. This is like when I showed you guys the skeleton. Like we have the skeleton right here. I don't know if you can see it. It's probably because I had the background on. But anyways, if you have the skeleton, we looked at the radius. It's probably not going to show up. But anyways, we looked at the radius and the ulna and the humerus, and we saw that that was similar even to a frog or an amphibian or a horse. And that means that we have to all trace our origins back to one ancient fish-like amphibian organism that was the first to develop this. The biggest thing about homologous structures is that they're evidence of a common ancestor. So homologous, same structure, different function. We have a common ancestor, and we got this feature through something called divergent evolution. So this is divergent. So for divergent evolution to work, that means that this one ancient ancestor diverged, it divided into these different evolutionary outcomes. All right, sorry about those lines. All right, so if you still don't know what homologous is, you can read this structure, this page right here. I'm gonna keep going. Analogous means same function, different structure. So wings, we have the wing of a bee and the wing of a bird. They're analogous. They do not share a common ancestor. That's the most important thing that you can know about analogous. They form from something called convergent evolution, where you have two organisms that are not related converging. They are not related. They will never be exactly like each other, but they do have similar functions based on different structures. So remember that whenever we have the prefix a, is not, maybe that'll provide a little help. So here are our analogous structures. We have a bird who flies with feathers. We have a bat that flies with the skin between its phalanges. I'm really curious as to what this is right here. Yeah. But anyways, and then we have the insect. If one of y'all knows what that is, email me and I'll give you 100 or something. All right, vestigial structures. Remember, these are structures that we have and not use. Humans have vestigial structures. Can you name it? I told you guys about the tailbone. Also, I told you about the wisdom teeth. The spleen or the appendix. These are things that we have and we don't need. They're vestigial. They're remnants of our evolutionary past. So vestigial, something we have and don't use. So there are some examples of vestigial structures. So embryology shows evolution, or it proves or provides evidence for the theory of evolution, because organisms that are not related look similar, or I'm sorry, organisms that are not obviously related look similar at embryonic stages. So vertebrate embryos have a fold of tissue in the neck region called gill pouches. In fish, they develop into gills. In humans, they develop into our inner ear bones. So we have similar structures at an embryonic state, but we're not necessarily, developing the same things from those structures. So here are different embryos. Embryos, they look similar. All right, our last piece of evidence. So we went over the fossil record, biogeography, comparative anatomy. That would be molecular biology and genetics. So genetics are probably the most compelling evidence for evolution, and Charles Darwin was never even able to see this part of the puzzle. So the genetic code is nearly identical in almost all organisms. All right. Sometimes you might see this word phylogeny. Phylogeny is basically just looking at different organisms and placing them into a tree. And we read these when we did our cladograms. So, I mean, if you're looking at them, really your goal, let me find a good one. Now, these are very complicated cladograms, but remember, when you have something like this is a common ancestor. And you don't have to know what the question mark means right now. But basically, it just means there's a common ancestor, and then there's a divergence here. And then you break into two groups, and you break into two more groups. And then eventually you get here. And which, if you were in class today or last Friday, you should know that these are the scientific names. So here's an example of that taxonomy. DNA sequencing. So mechanisms. So here are mechanisms of evolution. There are 5. We use the finger to use our hands to discuss the 5. So we say natural selection. I'll start with the pinky. Genetic drift, non-random mating, mutations, gene flow, and natural selection. So with natural selection, we usually use the opposable thumb, the finger that supposedly gives us the ability to be able to grip things such as pens, pencils, and such forth. Natural selection, we just talked about it. There's nothing different from what we just talked about. So if you don't know, skip back. Artificial, we talked about that. Mutations, those are what provide variation. The mutation is what happens randomly. Some mutations are good, some are bad. They're by no means, not all mutations are bad. That's usually a question. All right, mutation. Sorry, I was showing gene flow. But mutation, we use the middle finger, it's the longest finger. Mutations happen at random, and these alleles are just genes. So whenever you see the word allele, it's a gene. And when you have the change of a gene frequency in a population, that is technically microevolution. Gene flow. Gene flow is moving genes from one population to another. So whenever you have two populations that are either nearby or far apart, if one organism goes to the next population, you have genes flowing from one population to another. When those genes go here, you change the genes of the new population. You add to the gene pool. Non-random mating. This is where animals choose mates based on certain characteristics. Usually birds are the biggest examples to talk about because they have the most elaborate courtship rituals, and then you have the certain lizards that do that, and the birds that do it as well, and you have the 10-point bucks with their big antlers that they shed every season, for competing against other males and showing their display. All right, and then you get genetic drift. Genetic drift, we usually represent it with the pinky finger. Genetic drift is not directed towards any animal. Usually this is what we call the bottleneck effect. Let me see. Oh yeah, here we go. We got the bottleneck effect. The bottleneck effect occurs when a major population decline happens. And the reason we call it a bottleneck effect is if you think about a bottle, I'm going to try to draw a bottle. It's a terrible bottle, by the way. If you think about a bottle, Yeah, it's terrible. But anyways, the neck is smaller than the rest of the body. So that small part represents a major population decline. And that means only a few genes are left to pass on the traits of that entire gene pool. The founder effect, on the other hand, the founder effect is when you have an organism or new organisms that go into a new location and they start a population. Speciation, that's basically when animals turn into different species because of whatever reason. They can be separated by a huge landmass, an ocean. Think about Pangea, how it used to be all one continent, and eventually one day it just all separated. So that can form new species on other sides of that boundary. It happens over long periods of time, many generations. All right, adaptive radiation. Basically, new species can come about by being separated. That's basically the same thing as speciation. But as animals, especially birds, when they fly around and they fly away and they find a new area that they stay in, they lay eggs in, and they have multiple generations, basically, even over short distances, these birds can become different. Think about Darwin's finches. All those birds were really close together, but they were all different species. All right. Lastly, we're talking about the scientific naming, the taxonomy. Remember, the first name is going to be the genus, and the second name is going to be the species. So this is just telling you how to write it, but we're going to go into detail, short detail, because we just talked about that this week. Remember, the scientist that came up with this term, binomial nomenclature, was Carl Linnaeus, and he's talking about taxonomy. Taxonomy studies different groups of organisms. We don't have to know about Aristotle right now. We're going to focus our efforts on Carl Linnaeus. Remember, Carl Linnaeus was the scientist who was known for starting this system, this two-part naming system. Remember, binomial nomenclature, it means two-part naming system. Bi means two, nomial means name, nomenclature means system of naming. So you do need to know that binomial nomenclature is this definition right here. Okay, the scientific name is made up of two parts. Remember, the first part of the name is going to be the genus, and the second part of the name is going to be the species. So this is the genus, and this is the species. Genus and species. So there's your definition of genus. They share a common ancestor. Usually they look very similar, but what separates them from being a species is that members of the same species can breed and produce offspring. The species, I want you to think specific. That's the biggest hint when we're talking about species. So right here we get, the 8 taxa. We're going from least specific to literally most specific. Remember, you can't be more specific than species. Species is most specific. All right, 10 more slides to go. Now, looking at this, we wanted to see which organisms are most closely related. What you were supposed to do is look at the scientific names, and then we'd see that it would be these two, but only based on the fact that they're in the same genus, because they both have the same genus as indicated by the genus name. So this is walking down the process of the scientific name of a dog. So we have Animalia, which is the kingdom, phylum Chordata, Mammalia, which is the class, the order is Carnivora, family Canidae, genus Canis, Species is familiaris. So Canis familiaris is what we call, where is it? Oh, I didn't put the picture. But anyways, just a dog. All right, here's our last part. We're talking about the 6 different kingdoms. All right, with these 6 kingdoms, you need to know that Archaebacteria is a unicellular prokaryote. And actually, that prefix on here, the archae, means ancient. So your Archaebacteria is supposedly one of the first organisms that ever lived on Earth. Archaebacteria is unicellular, it's a prokaryotic organism, and it can be either autotrophic or heterotrophic. It has cell walls like all bacteria do, and it lives in harsh environments. These are the ones that I talked about can perform that term chemosynthesis earlier in this lecture. All right, if you need to get more from this, you can pause the video, write it down. Eubacteria, that prefix U means true. These are the true bacteria. These are ones that are found everywhere, but they're unicellular, they're prokaryotic. Unicellular, that means one cell. It's just made up of one cell. You can never have a multicellular bacteria. I want you guys to know that. Don't get confused by that. It's one cell. So U means true. Oops. All right. So that prefix U, we said, means true. Unicellular means one cell. And then prokaryotic means that it has no nucleus. All right, it can be autotroph or heterotroph. An autotroph can make its own food. It does have cell walls. It reproduces through binary fission. Basically, it just divides in 2. It's found in food. It can also cause human disease, such as food poisoning or tooth decay. But it can also be used for producing yogurt or cheese. So these are good and bad. All right, protista or protists. These are unicellular or multicellular. The difference about a protist is that it has a nucleus. It has a nucleus. So it's a protist, but it's not a prokaryote. That's the hardest part with protist. So a protist is a single-celled eukaryotic organism. It can be autotrophic or heterotrophic. And these are the 2 common words that you'll see. If you see these 2 words, euglena or amoeba, on a test, you need to remember, oh, that's the confusing one, because it's a protist, it's a protista with a nucleus. It has a nucleus. That's the biggest about those. Next, fungi. Fungi, what you need to know about fungi is that they're heterotrophic. They cannot make their own food. They do have cell walls made of chitin. They are eukaryotic, but they're not animals and not plants. They can be unicellular or multicellular. So fungi can be confusing if you get confused and say that they're producers. Remember, they are decomposers. They are not producers. And there was another word that we learned earlier, detritivores, but I'm going to go ahead and call them decomposers. All right, almost done. All right, plantae, so the kingdom of plants. So the 5th of our 6 kingdoms, they're multicellular. They're eukaryotic. They're autotrophic. They make their own food. They can reproduce in many ways, and they have cell walls. So plants pretty easy. Lastly, Animalia. Animalia, these are our multicellular eukaryotic organisms. They are heterotrophic. They have no cell walls. They reproduce through a process called meiosis, which is what we'll talk about in another unit. And they have some type of symmetry, which I'm pretty sure won't be on the test. But what you need to know about animals is that they're multicellular, eukaryotic, heterotrophic, and they don't have cell walls. If you can remember all that, I think you'll be good. Okay, so that brings us to, basically, I want you guys to take care of this review. This review is posted There might be one additional topic that we go over called dichotomous keys. If we do, I'll add the video to this. Wherever you find this video, I'll put the other video there and go into detail over it. But other than that, email me with any questions and good luck studying.